I think Islam hates us.
President Trump speaking about his controversial executive order.
Surveillance video shows a suspect punching, kicking, and stomping on a Muslim teenager in Brooklyn, New York.
So this is what we're up against. Welcome to the BHeard Town Hall, Muslim in New York, a community comes together. We're presenting this evening in conjunction with some great partners, the folks at CUNY Clear, the Intercept, and the Secret Lives of Muslims. And for the next 90 minutes, we're going to examine the culture of fear that surrounds many Muslim communities here in New York City, and examine how their civil rights are being impacted at lots of levels, from surveillance to street harassment to actual travel bans and other legislative measures. Civil rights. In 1967, just 4 months before a white supremacist bullet took his life, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. said, "In the end, we won't remember the words of our enemies, but the silence of our friends." So if you are, in fact, a friend tonight, we invite you to use your voice and stand with all sorts of marginalized communities. And tonight, we're going to be talking about attempts to marginalize the Muslim community in particular. It's a question that we're taking very seriously. And as a friend, wondering what it is that we can do, and looking at the Muslim community, what that even means when we're talking about a group as diverse and dynamic as Muslims right here in New York. These are the great folks that we've assembled here tonight, and they're all seated. I am, of course, standing, but I've got a seat at the table, and so do all of you. We've passed out some cards here, and if you have any questions, you can write them down and share them with us. And there's some audience producers who will be roving, and we'll make sure that you are heard tonight at this BHeard Town Hall. But just to let you know who these guys are, in addition to their credentials, we want to sort of take the temperature a little bit and ask you from your diverse perspectives as journalists and faith leaders, attorneys, historians, looking at empowerment. I wanted to ask you guys, what's the biggest lie that we've been fed about Muslims from each of your unique perspectives? Do you want to start?
Me?
Go for it.
I'm going to go with the lie that I'm assuming many in this room will go with. The biggest lie is that Muslims in this room, Muslims on this panel, Muslims in this country are a threat to their non-Muslim neighbors. The idea that Muslims are a terrorist threat, a security threat, are hiding under every bed waiting to kill you when you go to bed at night. It's a huge lie. The facts don't support it. The statistics don't support it. For every American killed by a Muslim terrorist, 1,000 are killed in acts of gun violence. You're twice as likely to be shot dead by a toddler as by a Muslim terrorist. You're more likely to be killed by your furniture falling on top of you. You're more likely to drown in the bathtub. You're more likely to be hit by a lightning strike than to be killed by a Muslim terrorist. But we're told day in, day out that Muslims are the biggest threat to American safety and security. So I think without a shadow of a doubt, that's the biggest lie. Just very quickly, there's a worse lie, though. The worst lie I've heard about Muslims.
Well, you might be stealing someone's thunder.
There's a worse lie. The person I'm stealing it from is, I'm sure we can all share him out. Donald Trump said last year during his election campaign, he said, I saw Muslims celebrate. We're in New York. He said, I saw Muslims celebrating on 9/11. He said, I watched it on TV. I saw the video. There is no video. There is no tape. And yet he doubles down and again in this dehumanizing way, suggesting that Muslim American citizens were celebrating the worst attack in America's modern history. The irony is there was someone celebrating on 9/11. It was Donald Trump. He called into his local TV station to brag that his building was now the tallest building in New York after the Twin Towers came down. But that's the kind of dehumanizing lies that we have to face day in, day out, sadly.
Imam?
Yeah, I would say definitely everything that Mehdi said I would echo. I think one of the biggest challenges that we face is a narrative that equates Islam to being from elsewhere. And when we don't understand that Islam is not only something that's 500 miles away or something that is based 500 years in the past, but has a deep legacy and history in this country. And I think one of the things that this country does quite often and regularly in its history, and unfortunately many countries around the world do, is erase narratives and histories of populations. And what we've seen is a complete erasure, I would say, not of American Islam only, but of African American Islam, giving people an indication that Muslims are not just people who come from Arab descent, South Asian descent. And part of the issue that comes from within that is that the otherization of Islam now lends itself towards that much more ease in broadly stereotyping and generalizing of the Muslim experience. That everyone is just Muslim in this one box, that the racialization of the religion has equated to being from elsewhere, that you're not able to somehow out-American an American when they say that Islam is un-American. When in reality, much of this country was built on the back of Muslims when they were brought here as slaves. And that legacy that is deep and rich in the African American narrative is one that you don't see really brought to surface, because there's a constant otherization that places Muslims coming from everywhere else other than from here.
Zaheer, I think he just opened the door for a historian.
He did. I think everything that he said, you know, the myth that Islam or Muslims are new to America, the myth that there is one profile of what a Muslim looks like, even well-meaning people, when they think about addressing the concerns of Muslims in America, and certainly even in New York, I've seen cultural institutions, not mine, but I've seen other cultural institutions, they've used this acronym MESA, Muslim, Arab, and South Asian, omitting and erasing the nearly 40% of Muslims who are of African descent, both immigrants from the continent, from the Caribbean, and people who are African American. And so I think that does a great service to people who want to portray Islam as new, who want to portray Islam as foreign, who want to ignore the ways that Muslims have shaped American life, as he said, from enslavement to the present. And so I think that is one of the biggest challenges in whenever we talk about Islam in America, whenever we talk about Muslims, to make sure that we're doing it in a way that we're not collapsing the diversity of Muslims into any one group of people. And that isn't to say that, the so-called, it's similarly the way that we talk about immigration and Muslims. Yes, there was a significant wave of immigration, of immigrant Muslims who came after 1965 when the quotas and bans were lifted. But Muslims as immigrants have been coming to the United States for well over a century. So you might look at someone and think that they're new because of they don't fit your profile of what an American is, but there may be 4 or 5 generations in this country.
Amna.
Yeah, I think one of the biggest problems I have with the way we talk about Muslims in America, and a lot of people talk a lot about Muslims in America, is that we refer to the Muslim community. And this is kind of feeding off a lot of the points that have already been made here. There's this idea of Muslim America as one monolith, right? That everyone practices the same way, that everyone believes in the same things in the same way. And Islam, like any other faith, has adherents at every part of the spectrum. Not all Muslims are brown, not all Muslims cover their heads, not all Muslims fast during Ramadan. And I think part of the problem in filling that gap of understanding with what it means to be Muslim in America and understanding what your neighbors and your colleagues live on a day-to-day basis is stopping that. Talking about Muslim communities, recognizing that in those 3.5 million people, just 1% of the American population, there's incredible diversity that, as has been referenced here, dates back to the very founding of this country. It's a huge problem, and it feeds into this otherization that the Imam talked about when you kind of link fear and violence with this community because you think everyone believes in the same thing, so one Muslim speaks for all.
So I'm looking at you, Doctor. Demolish a lie for us.
Absolutely. The one that gets under my skin is that Muslim women are oppressed. I can reassure you, I'm not oppressed. But what I hate about it is that I shouldn't have to walk around telling people I'm not oppressed. I want people to hear me. I want people to see the sophisticated woman that I am and what I have to offer. As someone working in the New York City public school system for over 25 years and working on a central headquarters level, when I used to visit schools, I can't begin to tell you how many times I've had safety agents say to me, 1 second, I'll get someone to translate for you. And then I have to look behind me to see who he's talking to. And I'm like, are you talking to me? And of course, they take a double take. So this whole notion of women being oppressed is something that really needs to be debunked. When we look at Muslim American women, they are on the same level of education as Jewish women and are quite prominent and sophisticated and in various professions within the American system. And so it's really critical that we, help our Muslim sisters debunk this lie.
Okay, prominent, sophisticated, educated. Naz, I think it's your turn.
Well, I think there are so many lies. My issue here is that
Which to pick?
is that everything about Muslims is pathologized in the same way that everything about being poor and black in this city is pathologized. So, if you're dragged into family court and you're Muslim, chances are you're being dragged in there because somebody's claimed excessive corporal punishment, or you haven't sent your kids to school. If you're a poor black mom, you're being dragged into family court because you smoked pot. Whereas, the white rich woman in Park Slope, it can write openly in the newspaper about, oh, hey, let's recommend to Princess Kate Middleton or whatever, smoke pot after you have kids, because it really reduces your anxiety. So the ways, and going off of the way Debbie was talking about, everything about you is pathologized. Everything is explained through the lens of your religion. So if there are situations of women there's sexual violence or sexual harassment in Muslim communities, it's explained by the fact that, oh, well, they're Muslim, that's what their culture or their religion tells them to do. Or it's right now we have perfect example in the newspapers of powerful white men who get away with decades of sexual harassment and abuse against women, and nobody's saying, oh, it's because he happens to be Jewish, or oh, it's because he's white, or it's because he's has money. There's not that single narrative attached to that story, and so that's my take on the biggest lie is everything is pathologized and explained by anything anybody wants to criticize about you. It comes back to the fact that you're Muslim.
Moustafa, you want to finish?
This question gets harder as it goes. Just to make
You're the professor.
But I guess I would add, in agreement with everything that's been said, I would add that one of the things that really gets under my skin as well is this narrative that we hear, or this phrase that we hear over and over again: Muslims don't condemn terrorism, right? Which is, of course, complete bunk, and it's so easily refuted. A simple Google search will do it. Just simple talking to your friends would do it if you had Muslim friends. In fact, statistics show that still the majority of the population in the United States still does not personally know a Muslim. And that actually, I think, connects to this idea that there's this notion that Muslims don't condemn terrorism. In fact, Muslims condemn terrorism all the time. But what really is the case, I think, over these last 15, 16 years, is essentially been a denial of the Muslim experience in various ways, particularly coming from various right-wing corners of the political spectrum in this country. So as somebody who's talked about Islamophobia over the spectrum from the days of 2001, even pre-2001 until today, I can tell you that for a very long time, when I was speaking in public about questions around Islamophobia, I would have to prove to the public that Islamophobia exists, because there was a long narrative that said, oh, you're just exaggerating, Islamophobia doesn't exist. And in fact, what happened, I believe, is that with the rise of Donald Trump, suddenly now there's general acceptance that Islamophobia exists. And from the Muslim point of view, I gotta say, it's well, we're all glad you're here, but what took you so long? And in fact, it's really important because it seems that what it is an instrumentalization, essentially, of a recognition of Islamophobia. So it becomes part of our political discourse rather than actually acknowledging the situations that Muslim Americans and Muslims in this country are in.
I see Mehdi jumping out of his seat.
I just wanted to jump. It's such a good point Moustafa made about the majority of Americans not knowing a Muslim. I think the statistics are 38% of Americans say they know a Muslim. But what's interesting is they say they don't know a Muslim. In actual fact, they almost certainly probably do know Muslims. Their doctor, their nurse, police officer, teacher. It's just they don't think of them as a Muslim because that's not the Muslim they see on the news. They assume the Muslim to be the big bearded guy or the woman in the hijab or niqab. So they don't think, oh, my doctor, my pediatrician is actually a Muslim too. They don't think in that. So then they tell a pollster, we don't know. And that's part of the problem with the whole diversity, having the stereotypical image of what a Muslim should look like. I don't know that person. I don't know any Muslims, which is not the reality, especially in New York.
So Amna, let's get outside of New York for a minute, at least theoretically. I've watched you go all over the country in the course of the election and bump into people who maybe didn't know that you were a Muslim, and they had the longest conversation that they've ever had with a Muslim person. But what is out there beyond the borders of New York in terms of the way people are relating from your experience?
Yeah, I think there's a very real possibility that there are a lot of communities in America where they have never met someone who's Muslim. I think there are cases like Mehdi is saying where you just don't know someone's Muslim. I know a lot of people talk to me, and because I don't fit the profile of what they think a Muslim looks or acts or talks like, they'll say, you're not really Muslim, right? And I get that a lot. So I've been in parts of the country, and I'm reporting on a story now in a specific county in America that actually had the highest concentration of Trump voters in the 2016 election. It is not surprising. It's overwhelmingly white, it's overwhelmingly Christian, and I am legitimately the first Muslim that they have ever met. And that gets the full range of reaction. And that's not uncommon in my experience reporting before the election, before 9/11, and any community where people have not come into contact with something or someone that is familiar to them in some way, you get a lot of questions. And I will say that the one thing I have found that can overcome this idea of fear that is based on unfamiliarity. And for most Americans, it is unfamiliarity. They know about Islam in a very specific context and in the very narrow way that they've heard about it and learned about it. The only thing that makes a difference, that gets them over that fear, is that personal contact. It's connecting a feeling over the fear, where I know you, I get details of your life, I can humanize you beyond this idea that I've constructed in my head. That's the only thing I found that actually works.
Well, speaking of fear and construction and identity, we also got to meet two young women recently who are actually teenagers. One whose family came from Yemen just about 2 years ago, another born and raised right here in Brooklyn. And they've struck up an unlikely friendship that in the past year has become really strong, and they've discovered their unmutable voices through activism this last election cycle. So have a look at ZNN.
Hello, New York. Welcome to Radio Hikayat, where young Arab women from Brooklyn talk politics, culture, and feminism.
I have a friend. She said her mom, after 9/11, she said they're from Yemen, and that's the sad part, because Yemeni people are really strict about their culture. And she took off their hijab, and they changed her name. Her mom told her not to speak about Islam or nothing, because of that fear,
My name was changed, like as you said, my mom or me or my sister doesn't wear the hijab, so lots of people don't even know that we're Muslim.
That's sad to, hide who you really are. I mean, America is like religious freedom. What's the point of religious freedom if you're not allowed to wear what you want to wear?
Say if I was to describe you to someone, be like, oh, that hijabi girl, because you're not just a hijabi girl, you're Zainab.
I mean,
it's a part of who you are. It shouldn't be your whole thing.
You can label me with the hijabi and my name, not just the hijabi
That's what I'm
girl.
saying. But you're saying the first time when people see you, they'll see you as a hijabi girl. I'm saying,
and I'm okay with it because I am a hijabi girl.
My friends for next year is gonna be my Noble phone. That's it.
I'm not gonna make friends so much.
Stop! No, you have to.
Because I'm picky with making friends. I'm really picky of making friends.
How are you picky? You should have been picky with me. We're totally different.
I know, but we're not as close, to be honest.
Oh, so you don't consider me your friend, Zena?
I mean, I consider you my friend, but we don't chill often, you know?
Can you chill?
Yes, I can chill.
So why don't you tell me?
Because we're different, you know?
So what?
You wanna go in the pizza place? I knew that Trump was gonna do, because he was basically saying we're gonna ban all Muslims. You see, all those people came together.
All of the Muslims.
So, you know, at the airport and stuff, that made a difference. You know, we got encouraged. We can speak again, and why not? Why not keep on speaking till we make a difference, or probably will, you know, change something.
So I just wanted to give a quick shout out to Z and In. They're somewhere in the audience tonight. Where are you guys? They're right in front of you. She's got her face covered, but we've already seen you. Thank you for giving us a glimpse into your friendship. We appreciate it. So if that sparked any questions, or if you guys have been thinking about something, we're going to be going to audience questions in just a second. So if you got them, hold them up and let us know. But looking at how a culture of fear sort of pervades communities, I have another, I guess, side of that coin. When we saw how someone perverted Christianity in Carolina and opened fire inside a black church, knowing our collective memory here in New York City, where we've actually experienced a terror event as well by someone who would have perverted Islam for their own will. How do you tell folks in the New York context who've seen that, who have the muscle memory of walking across the Brooklyn Bridge when they couldn't get home, to not be afraid? How do you overcome that fear of otherness to reveal a person on the other side? I see you shaking your head.
Well, I shake my head because I was in New York City on 9/11. I'll never forget that day. I don't think any of us who live in New York City will ever forget that day. I taught at PS 261, and my building actually faces the skyline. And I remember that very morning picking up my kids to take them to the class. The sky was beautiful. The two towers were so magnificent standing there, and just breathing that beautiful air in the morning, and then a couple hours later, seeing what had happened happen. And that fear began that very afternoon, when people in my school were telling me, Debbie, you can't go home by yourself. And a colleague of mine took me home with her that night. It was probably 5 o'clock after all of our children were taken home and the buses took them home. And when we were waiting for the red light, there was a man who saw me in my hijab sitting in the back seat, and her daughter and her were sitting in the front. And he started to yell and scream and point his finger, you did this to us. I couldn't wait for that light to finish. It felt like an eternity. But by the time it turned, I was just terrified and realized at that moment this was just the beginning. And shortly after September 11th, there was a great deal of backlash and discrimination. But I also want to uplift and highlight the beauty of our neighbors coming together and working in solidarity, from the escorting system that we did shortly after the days of 9/11, to the detentions and deportations where I and members of Brooklyn came together, where we were actually protesting outside the Brooklyn Detention Center for 6 months, demanding the names and the charges that Muslim men were actually taken and actually detained in that center for many months. And so there was a huge, incredible movement of people standing with us. And now here we are again in that moment, where we were first, after 9/11, terrorized by the government, and now really more or less by people in general, such as the Islamophobia industry, and now, of course, the latest government that we have sitting, that's actually terrorizing us and making it much more legitimate for people to act out on the very things that they used to just think, but now are acting them out. And so looking at where we are today, we are now again at a moment where those who actually sat in the sideline, not really thinking that they can help, have come forward. We've developed an incredible movement of people who've come together regardless of their race, religion, culture, sexual orientation, that are saying we are all American and we are all in this together. And so, you know, watching this video breaks my heart because I was that little girl one day. And I am now today an adult, and it breaks my heart that I still see this happening, this cycle of fear and feeling like the other. But I want to say to this beautiful young woman that I'm so proud of you, and I want to hear your voice, and I want to see you standing tall and speaking proud, and be proud of your hijab, be proud to be a Yemeni American. I walk around now double proud of who I am. I'm a Yemeni American and proud. I'm a Muslim American woman and proud. And that's what all of our girls need to hear today. And I want all of our allies, every time that you see any of us, lift us up and celebrate us, because we need it.
So Imam, she's clearly made it to the other side. How do you work with people who are still struggling in their feelings as the other, and people who would cast them in that role?
You know, I think we have to understand what the fear is rooted in is not simply an attack as atrocious as the attack was, but really how narrative gets imposed upon populations on a mass level. And there's not mechanisms at play that can match those systemic and structural processes that get populations to think about populations other than themselves without ever having actually interacted with them, right? I was just in Bangladesh at the border between Myanmar and Bangladesh visiting 500,000 refugees from Myanmar who are fleeing ethnic cleansing and genocide. And aside from hearing what it was like to witness loved ones be burned alive and homes be burned alive and acid poured on bodies of people and mass rape, etc., one of the most troubling things that I heard was that the Myanmar government was dictating how humanitarian organizations would talk about the crisis. And they said, you can't call these people Rohingya, because they don't want it to come across that there's actually discrimination coming. The second day we were there, relief organizations were told that you can't even use the word refugee. And if you will, we won't let you bring goods in to help the people in Myanmar. And somebody said to me, well, is that alarming to you? Like, can you imagine a government would do that? And I said, yeah, our government does it to all kinds of minorities. That's what they've been doing to black people since the country was founded. But where we understand the other a lot of the times comes from an us versus them mentality that's imposed upon us by individuals who have no interests other than their own self-interest. They take advantage of the fact that we don't come together so well, and they get us to think what it is that they want to think. So September 11th happened, it was a horrendous thing. 2 months later, Jack Bauer is created as a character on the show 24. And you could say, well, they're just trying to help the country heal, but very likely people know how their ad revenues will jump up because they want to take advantage of a population that has already been sensitized to a perspective of Muslims as being from someplace else. And the synergy that media then has with politicians that are utilizing words like Islamist, jihadist, terrorist, all kinds of things that start to impose upon that population an understanding of Muslims in a certain frame, that fear was there long before and has gotten to a place where it's become unchecked and unfiltered because there's so many more people who have the ability to speak against it, and they're sitting back and they're doing nothing. I think personal narrative becomes really critical. So a story of a young woman that is courageous enough to talk about and make herself vulnerable is great, but that's not an expectation that we have of anybody else. Like, why does that young woman have to put herself out there like that? Why does she have to bear the burden all of a sudden of being responsible, of being anything other than who she is because we are a country that is heavily laden in prejudice. We have a deeply entrenched anti-blackness that everything is built upon. And the anti-Muslim sentiment that we see today, I would say, is symptomatic of that. but so many people become indifferent to those realities. And then you have governmental apparatus, people who are motivated by egocentricity and selfishness, taking advantage of the fact that our unfamiliarity creates immense opportunity for them to create more ignorance that lends towards fear, that distracts them from seeing the inequities that are getting imposed around.
So speaking of inequities being imposed, Naz, I want to go to you. The Imam just talked about some of the entertainment media's response, but a lot of things happened legislatively, executively in the follow-up to 9/11, but in the 2017 context, where's the fire now? What should we be paying attention to most besides any round of tweets that just got fired off?
Well, 2017 feels like playing a game of whack-a-mole. I know a lot of people here, and Debbie and people who've been working on issues around the Muslim and refugee ban and all of the different things that seem to be coming down in terms of expansions of things that we've already seen. Because the thing is that a lot of the things we're seeing now are just built upon structures that were put in place maybe under Bush, under Obama. I mean, somewhat separately, but on the same topic, like the deportation system was built during Bush and solidified during Obama, and so that's why Trump can do what he wants right now. And so the Muslim ban is the Muslim bans have been an extension of, for example, the really long delays that Yemenis in particular, but a lot of people from Muslim majority countries would face in applications for visas for family members. The CARP program that USCIS was running that basically dictates that you will delay or deny applicants from Muslim majority countries or find pretextual reasons to deny them. The no-fly list, up until maybe like 5 years ago, if you were on the no-fly list and you were a citizen or a green card holder and you were stuck overseas, there wasn't technically a process in place for you to come back to the United States. There wasn't this like one-time waiver process, you know, and so all of these things like the visa adjudication, the exclusion of people, deportation, the use of detention shortly after 9/11, the use of like these very specific immigration laws, and watch lists, really people who are basically traumatized every time they go to fly. I can't tell you how many clients we have, and I've heard Imam Khalid talk about this, who are they avoid flying because it's such a hassle with their children. Everybody gets patted down, they get treated like they're all carrying bombs, but they've gone through this process so many times and nothing ever comes of it, and they spend years on these lists. And so I think that, you know, one thing that I would want to remind everybody is that so much of what we're seeing is just an extension of things that have been happening for the past 10, 20, 30 years, and we're just seeing them like on steroids.
All right, we're going to inject some town into the town hall and go to this question, but Mehdi, did you have something?
I'll add it after the
Okay. All right, so just...
Assalamu alaikum. Hello. So I have had interactions with people where when they find out that I'm Muslim, will say something like, oh, but you know, you're one of the good ones. And so my question is, how would you respond to people who tell you that Islam needs to reform?
I mean, this is the problem, the challenge with the idea that this problem can be solved through interpersonal interaction, right? You know, again, drawing on historical reference, black and white people have been interacting forever in the United States, and it has not solved the problem of racism in America. And this goes back to what Debbie and Imam Khalid talked about, that, you know, fear is not just a naturally occurring thing. It is constructed, it is stoked, it is produced, it is funded. There is a whole apparatus that is funding both in policy, in discussions, in media, you know, this fear and apprehension. So yes, if you have an encounter with someone who is like your doctor, your cab driver, the person serving your sandwiches on the corner store, whatever, of course you won't think of them as Muslim. It's the problem that because those people become exceptions to the rule. And the rule is being set by this apparatus. And so I think when we talk about how to deal with this, how to deal with fear, how to deal with, and I'm not saying that people's sense of loss isn't real, but I'm saying how that's constructed, how it's shaped, how it's targeted is very much fashioned. And so what we have to do is challenge the rule. Otherwise, we'll always be exceptions to the rule. You know, you'll always be the good one, the good black person, the good Muslim, the good whoever, right? And so until we really get to these kind of, the way that these narratives are reproduced structurally, we're still going to have to deal with that.
So if we move past this sort of notion of exceptionalism and making it your responsibility to be the good Muslim and change the world's image, what are the systems at work that reinforce those things? I remember last year everybody was walking around with Michelle Alexander's book, The New Jim Crow, like it was the Quran or the Bible or something, where you could see systems built on racism and why it continues to play out. But in this lens, through an Islamist sort of way, who's benefiting from that continued Islamophobia and the bad images that are perpetrated so often? The systems at play instead of just personality politics.
Well, there's a very good point you make about the systems and who's benefiting. People think that Islamophobia is just a product of terrorist attacks, and we talked about it in this context. Terrorists blow something up and say Allahu Akbar, and non-Muslims say, well, I'm afraid now of Muslims. And actually the evidence doesn't support that view, actually. In fact, after the Orlando attack, which was until Las Vegas, one of the biggest mass shootings in modern times in American history, anti-Muslim sentiment went down, not up, partly because of the campaign, and we talked about Donald Trump, pushing people into realizing there is Islamophobia. There's actually studies being done that Islamophobia spikes not after terrorist attacks, it spikes in America every 4 years. I wonder what happens in America every 4 years. Politicians exploit this stuff, and we've seen the master of it, who's now sitting in the Oval Office, to get ahead, to win votes. And we saw this under every president of the modern era. We saw this for both political parties, not just a Republican issue. Now the Democrats are kind of coming around to this argument late, as Moustafa pointed out. But I remember Bill Clinton standing in the Democratic National Convention, well-intentioned Bill, saying, if you love America and you'll fight terrorism, you can stay with us. That was his message to Muslim Americans. If you love America, conditional, as if Muslim Americans don't, and if you fight terror, as if it's the job of Muslim Americans to be the front line of fighting ISIS in Iraq. That is the kind of mentality that doesn't help, and politicians do exploit this stuff. As Zaheer is right to point out, this fear is not. I'm not denying that lots of people do have legitimate fears, but as a general rule, it's not some spontaneous response to violence. That's what we really need to push back against in terms of narratives, as Khalid said at the start. We do need to understand the role of the Islamophobia industry in pushing these narratives, these pseudo-experts who turn up on cable news, who can't pronounce a single name in Arabic, have never stepped foot in the Middle East, but feel qualified to pontificate about reforming Islam, people who couldn't tell you what was in the Quran if their life depended on it. These are people who are pushing political, financial agendas to construct this image of Islam, and it's a much bigger problem than just a terrorist attack or a single individual or a particular moment in time.
Yeah, I mean, there was a study called Fear Inc. that traced
millions of dollars.
Millions of dollars. There's funding. The people who are hired as consultants for the Department of Defense, for the Department of State, for local police departments, with crackpot ideas, right? People who are hired as pundits on regular news programs, certain networks that thrive off of promoting these ideas, certain websites. I mean, we can name them, but they're very clear. This is not
rhymes with box.
Yeah, there's not. This is not like conspiracy theory. There's like a clear line that you can draw connecting the money, the politicians. We need campaign finance reform in order to stop that. Connecting the people who are consultants that are hired, who have been fired. Like Michael Flynn was crazy, and he was one of those people. And that's
the worrying thing. They're not on the fringes anymore. A few years ago, we would have sat and laughed at these people as fringe bloggers. Now they have offices in the West Wing of the White House.
That's right.
That is a real problem.
So you asked the question. If you want, we can start naming them, right? But this is how this, to your point, why Islamophobia, is a construction. It is something. It's not just a naturally occurring phenomenon.
But I think we also have to remember here, I'm going to push back just a little bit on what you guys are saying, because yes, while Islamophobia will spike every 4 years, I'm a journalist, I believe in the power of the people. Those people who are out there pushing those ideas get voted into office by the American public. And I think that part of the gap of understanding rests on media, on entertainment, on filling it with humanized versions of the characters that people have been fed for so long. And we're talking about Islamophobia, time-stamping it from 9/11, and we all know it goes way, way before that. I mean, there was a time in American history when whiteness was a prerequisite for citizenship. We're talking about people of Yemeni origin being denied citizenship as recently as 1950 or late 1940s was the latest case. So this is nothing new in a lot of ways. I know we're talking about the industry, and that absolutely exists as an accelerant to a lot of that fear that was already very, very deeply seated in America. So what we're up against is not a modern phenomenon. And I'll push back also on the idea that human-to-human contact doesn't make a difference, because when you've seen in American public sentiment things change on a mass scale, take for example the support for same-sex marriage, what happened over the course of that time? It was that more people knew someone who was directly affected by that policy. And when you look at Muslim Americans, the studies show just 10 years ago, I think it was half of all Muslim Americans said that most of their friends were Muslim. That's changed. Now the last studies showed that only a third of American Muslims say that most of their friends are Muslim. And as the community changes, as the community grows,
but the minority are always going to have more friends from the majority. It's the majority that's the problem, because the majority who say they don't know enough Muslims, who don't feel the need to get to know Muslims, and as with every group throughout history, it's always the minority who are expected to do the heavy lifting in terms of defeating discrimination. And a lot of younger members of minorities would say now, and this is not just a Muslim issue, it's not our job to get rid of your racism. It's not my responsibility to prove to you that I'm not a terrorist. It's your job to open your eyes up to kind of discrimination and inequality. And that's an ongoing American conversation.
That's why the new Jim Crow is a great example, right? I mean, when you see how the war on drugs is actually constructed, right? Crack is pumped into black neighborhoods. Politicians are utilizing words like thug and predator. You have TV shows like Cops that literally have white men in blue uniforms arresting black men on live TV, and the whole while mass incarceration is spiking like crazy, and the whole country's just sitting and watching, right? The war on terror doesn't build itself out in any different way, and what you've seen is the destabilization of entire regions of the world under the guise of certain premises, when in reality it goes back to everything that's being said. I do a lot of work in terms of interfaith, multi-faith work. I don't think that the idea that human interaction has like flaws to it. There's definitely things that are there that are valid. But to put the onus upon a population that is oppressed, to say that it is on you to break the oppression, when the oppressor has literally built that oppression in a systemic and structural way, I think is really problematic. That's like the notion that says if black people just worked harder, the situation would be different for them, right? But the ceilings that are imposed and those comments that are usually being made are not being made by the black people who are pushing against the systems. It's being made by the people who made the systems in the first place, right? And when we can't recognize and understand that there's certain things that some people will go through that the rest of us will never go through, because we are not their skin color, we are not in their class, we are not of their race and ethnicity, but we can constantly tell them what they need to be doing in order to make their lives better, as opposed to recognizing that there's a lot of racism in this country. And a lot of that racism exists not just in somebody called me a bad name, but it exists on an institutionalized level that seeks to do nothing less than retain power and wealth within specific demographics in this country and not care whose lives will be obliterated. You're talking about hundreds of thousands of black people that were put unjustly into prisons. You're talking about millions of people whose lives have been devastated by drones dropping on countries all over the world. And we have a population here that lives in a space that only identifies minorities through what they see on TV, like not through real interaction. They are in schools that perhaps will teach them about African American history as an elective in college at some point, right? I went to Standing Rock and stood with the tribes there. What I learned about Native Americans in 4th grade is not what the chieftains of those tribes were telling me their lives are like. You know what I'm saying? But all of that converges, and then it gets us into this place where we readapt this notion of a good Muslim, bad Muslim, that says, I need to be the one that somehow brings you to a place of understanding of me, when in reality, like that one-on-one interaction can catalyze some change. But every day there are like massive movements that are solely built upon how do we continue to hold down people that we just don't really want to be in our spaces and places.
Well, looking... Well, one of the big furtherances of that narrative is something that happened globally and right where we live with the declaration of a war on terror. We know that there were at least 300 cases of folks who had cases and were brought before judges because they were specifically caught in FBI snares. These were sting operations. And behind each of those 300 is a family, is an individual whose life was affected. We're gonna share a story right now of a young man who has been without a father for the last 15 years following a snare that happened in his home and in his life. And this is Abu's story.
The Justice Department has just concluded a news conference in Washington, D.C. involving the overnight raid of a mosque on Central Avenue in Albany.
36-year-old Yasin Aref and 51-year-old Mohammed Hossein were both sentenced Thursday to 15 years in federal prison for their involvement in a fake terror plot.
An opportunity was provided, a test. There was no question it was a test, and these individuals failed that test.
Let me say a word about what this case is and what it is not. This is not a case connected to the current terrorist threat. This is not a case where the defendants were discovered plotting terrorist violence.
My name is Hamza, and I am the son of Muhammad Musharraf Hussain. He was accused for money laundering, conspiracy against the government, and being a witness, something of that sort. Until now, I don't fully know what it is. I think I was 11. I was 11. We were in shock. We were in disarray. It's a destruction of a family. You take away the head, you destroy the family. Some people pitied me, and some people, they genuinely wanted to help me. Some people tried to take advantage of us because we didn't have a father and stuff like that. But I tried my best as the eldest son to protect the family as best I knew how, you know. And my mom was trying to make the best that she could do with whatever means she had. And she had to be so strong for so long that, you know, sometimes she would just break down and she would just like, you know, bawl her eyes out. A few marriage proposals of mine got shut down. A lot of the friends that I had, they veered off from me. Like, they kind of found their own places. There have been times, very rough times, in which I thought to disassociate myself with everything and take on a new identity. Because of the pain and the pressure and the discrimination, right now the Muslim world is facing crisis.
So $1 trillion spent on a war on terror and one family broken up later. Are we safer for Abu's dad being in jail?
No, of course not. I mean, that's one very tragic story of innumerable stories like this now. And I think it really reveals a kind of stress that the Muslim communities currently in this country are currently living under. And the levels of law enforcement infiltration into our daily lives is something that I think is generally underappreciated by American society at large. And I think we really have to pay attention to it, if only for the fact that we also have the same kinds of revelations coming from the Edward Snowden leaks, for example, that we have the elaboration of the NSA into everybody else's daily life too. What's happening to the Muslim community is in part also a part of a larger picture that is happening to general American society. And I think it's actually a really dangerous element into our social contract. The basis of the American social contract is essentially that the government is meant to operate publicly so that you have the right to a private life. And what's happening with the war on terror is that there's a flip there, so that the government is demanding more and more secrecy, and they want us to be very public. They want to have access into every element of our private life. And so really what's at stake is not just the pain and devastation that happens to Muslim communities, but it's really at the very fabric of our constitution and our society.
Yeah, I think it's really critical to also mention, Moustafa was talking about the stress. This is psychological warfare on American Muslims. I think about the children, our children that we are raising, this trauma that they are experiencing, the fact that we have so many youth that are changing their name from Muhammad to Mo, and so on and so forth, is just truly, truly devastating. And this is because of the fact that we live in a society where Muslims are seen as the other, where people are supposed to fear Muslims. And so how do we raise vibrant, young, incredible people when there is all of this that they're experiencing, and then they see a story like this, or they have friends who've experienced this? I mean, this poor man can't even get married. This is just going totally against everything that is supposed to be the American dream of being able to have a family, to raise your children, to educate your children, and then we see stuff like this.
I would just say, it's a very good point you made about psychological trauma, and of course, it's not just Muslims who are the victims of it. I mean, one of the great myths about Islamophobia is it's something that Muslims experience. In fact, there's a human cost across the country to Islamophobia. Everyone is a victim of Islamophobia. Everyone is a victim of the war on terror. We have an entire society now living in fear, being told to be afraid all the time, being told, as I said at the start, that terrorists are going to kill you any minute now, when actually terrorists are one of the lowest down threats in terms of the threats to your life as an American. And that comes back to this whole narrative of the war on terror. You asked at the beginning what was the biggest lie. Another big lie was the idea that you need a war on terror to keep us safe, which is absolute nonsense. Over the last 16 years, all the war on terror has given us is more war and more terror. I don't think any American, Republican or Democrat, Trump supporter, non-Trump supporter, thinks that they feel safer today than they did on September the 12th, 2001. It's absurd. We've spent trillions of dollars, lives lost, fear, families broken up, people don't feel any safer. And now you have a president of the United States who is basically a recruiting sergeant for terrorist groups. He's the greatest gift you could ever give a group like ISIS. So it makes everything 100 times worse than it already was. And Naz mentioned earlier all the things he inherited. And yet he's putting them all on steroids, which is a great boost to both the terrorism industry and the terrorists.
Which is why I call Donald Trump vanilla ISIS.
Levity. Before we jump to this question, I wanted to ask you, Mehdi, about a piece you wrote following the events in the UK this summer when Theresa May stood outside and said, okay, we have a serious problem. I'm going to outline ways now that we can begin to combat Islamophobia, to which you said, what took so long?
Yeah.
So I'd like to just round robin with all of you guys and ask what needs to happen in America before we take Islamophobia seriously on that level?
I mean, the number one thing we need, you used a quote from MLK at the start, remember the silence of our friends. I think Moustafa made the point very eloquently at the beginning that people are coming late to this party. Now, we shouldn't be ungrateful. We shouldn't kind of mock people who are coming late. But on the other hand, there is a genuine sense of, yes, where were you? What are you going to do now? And how seriously are you still taking it? I mean, for me, Charlottesville, a lot of people watched what happened in Charlottesville. Many of you have seen the Vice video of those marchers shouting, Jews will not replace us. Horrific images. And we're all shocked by the outrageous public anti-Semitism that was shown there. But a lot of people watched it and thought, that's horrific anti-Semitism. A lot of Muslims watched it and said, that's horrific anti-Semitism. But you know what? These same guys have been saying the same stuff about Muslims for years. The alt-right didn't start out as anti-Semites a couple of 2-3 years ago. They were saying much more worse things about Muslims. And I kind of think, a lot of us are like, it's very frustrating when your fellow non-Muslim says, this is outrageous. And you say, yes, but it's not just that group. It's this group, it's that group. And yes, Muslims have been the canary in the coal mine for a long time. A lot of these right-wing groups that are worrying people in America today by going after black people, going after Jews, they were going after Muslims a long time ago, but Muslims are fair game because terrorism, 9/11, etc., etc. So I think we do need to ask those questions about when are we going to take it, not just acknowledge Islamophobia, but take it seriously, accept how bad the problem is. I still see profiles of Steve Bannon and Sebastian Gorka and others. You know, he's a nationalist, he's incendiary. The guy who got elected in Alabama the other day as the Republican candidate, described as kind of a firebrand judge. No, these guys are complete anti-Muslim bigots. He wants to ban Islam and criminalize Islam. Call them what they are. Let's not kind of mollycoddle these people. Let's not indulge them. Let's not stand around the fridges. Let's call it out. As I said earlier, call them out.
Yeah. I think we have to just amplify the good voices,
yes.
Amplify the positive voices, amplify as many Muslim voices as possible, center Muslims in the storytelling of their own experience, so that it isn't just one-on-one. So people are exposed to a multiple, diverse perspectives and voices. And I think whether we're working with institutions, strengthen our institutions to support that, work on funding it. I mean, I hate to sound like, about like nuts and bolts, but we have to develop a counter infrastructure, a counter hegemonic infrastructure that challenges the embeddedness of these phobias, of whether it's racism or excessive sexism or any of the other kinds of ways that people are othered. And I think we have to build that. It can't just be from the ground up. It has to be from the from the top down as well. And so whether your friends are parallel to you, your friends are, have positions of power where they control resources, or they can mobilize people who do. I think we have to do all of those things at the same time.
You know what we need in this country? Honestly, we need a real anti-war movement. Yeah. Because the fact is that war drives the war on terror, as Mehdi was saying. The State Department actually keeps figures as to how many terrorist attacks there are globally, worldwide. And I believe the numbers in 2001 were somewhere in the around 300 and change. And in 2015, the last year that was available when I last looked, it was 11,700 and some, right? Not a very successful war on terror, if you ask me, right? And the fact is, these overseas wars are fueling the Islamophobia that we are also suffering under in the United States. And these wars are terribly damaging to the American economy, to civil life in this country. Just in the September alone, under Donald Trump, they dropped 741 bombs on Afghanistan. When Donald Trump ran on the fact that he was going to withdraw from Afghanistan or slow down the war in Afghanistan.
It's unlike him not to keep his word.
And quite frankly, it's actually the longest war that the United States have been in historically.
And yet nobody seems to care in this country. This is the problem. There was a very powerful article written by Andrew Basovich that came out just earlier this week about the fact that we have these longue durée wars that are not changing anything about the American propensity to go to war. This is actually our responsibility. We can blame the politicians as much as we want, but it's our responsibility. This is our society. We have the responsibility to change the warmongering stance of this country.
We have a question here.
Okay. So, assalamu alaikum, everybody. Thank you for sharing your knowledge. I think it's safe to assume everybody in this room knows what homophobia is, correct? And now, after this panel, it's safe to assume that everybody understands Islamophobia, correct? And then anti-blackness, for example, came up in this conversation, and Orlando came up in this conversation. Something that's missing from this conversation is acknowledging that there are queer LGBTQ Muslims, like I do, exist, and I was erased during these times when Orlando happened. When I went to the gay community are like, you're gay and Muslim? That can't happen, don't they kill you? And I'm like, but didn't you hear that homophobia actually exists also here in the United States? And then in Muslim communities, even allies said, shh, we support you, but we can't say that queer Muslims exist within our community. So please, my ask to you is, can you say that LGBTQ Muslims do exist and that you will work with us hand in hand to combat all kinds of racism, all kinds of homophobia, and all kinds of any phobia or racism that we will face? So
Hear,
please.
hear. Absolutely.
think that was a yes. All right. I also have a question card right here talking about diversity. Yeah, have a seat. Diversity and centering voices. So gatherings like this claim diversity as American Muslims, but African American presence is lacking. How can this be changed? So fully aware that a third of the Muslims in New York City are African American folks. So why are their voices not as present or centered or brought to the front? Looking at you, brown man.
Well, I mean, I think it's interesting, the previous question about homophobia. Look, racism, homophobia, sexism, nativism, these are all American pastimes. And to the degree that we have all become American, to the degree that Muslims strive to demonstrate how American they are, we too risk participating in one form of othering or another in order to secure our own place in the, get our piece of the American pie at the expense of other people. And within the context of the Muslim community, there has been, I'll call it an anti-Islamophobia industry, where spokespeople have emerged, and they have gotten, plum positions. They've received plum funding, bylines. They are sought after by the media, but they don't challenge the kind of structural basis of phobia, which is inequity and inequality. There is there's a history of othering in the United States. The Irish faced it, the Italians faced it, the Jews faced it, the Chinese faced it, the Japanese faced it, and many people look at, say, the experience of how Catholics and Jews were excluded in American life as the model for, Muslim assimilation or integration into American life. But what they don't understand or they don't see is that, for many Catholics and Jews, what accompanied their eventual incorporation into American life was whiteness, which most Muslims don't have, right?
Also, those minorities weren't part of a community that was at war abroad.
Well,
the global war context with Moustafa is also crucial.
So, I mean, this is, the experience of African American Muslims is both, an immense resource. You look at the issue of NYPD and police surveillance. Well, Muslim communities, African American Muslim communities were under surveillance in the 1950s and 60s, under the Red Squad, under the Bureau of Special Services, under the FBI COINTELPRO. So there is a line that we can draw there. And so I think, we have that resource. But the problem, this is a challenge to Muslims, right? If you connect your life, your legacy, your struggle to the line of African American Muslims, you are potentially rejecting the promise of American assimilation and the narrative of the ascendant immigrant, right? And do you want to do that? James Baldwin called it the price of the ticket. That the price of being able to become American was being able to become American against someone who was not, right? And historically, black people have been that not. People come to America and they say, who do I want to be? I know who I do not want to be, right? And for Muslims, we have to face that reality.
Well, I also, just building off what you had said before too, when you say you have to call people out for what they are, I think the onus is on all of us to be able to call out the very real things in our own communities that also continue to hold us back and feed into that otherization. And there is absolutely, as the guest over there mentioned, there is absolutely rampant homophobia. There is racism in a lot of Muslim communities. There is misogyny in a lot of Muslim communities, just like there is in every other American community. And I think when we acknowledge that, when we step up and say, I'm not going to stand for that in the same way I won't stand for Islamophobia, that's where the power of the actual people comes from.
I completely agree with Amna. Just to deal with the question from the lady there before. I mean, the problem, of course, is that you're not having these debates in a vacuum, right? The context is still the war on terror, Islamophobia. You can't just wish that away. I wrote an article a few years ago about rampant homophobia in the Muslim community. A lot of Muslims reached out to me privately and said, completely agree with everything you said, but you shouldn't have written that piece. Why? Because you're fueling Islamophobia. You're giving a weapon to bigots to beat us with, which is true. You'll see now far-right activists who never gave a damn about gay rights now go on gay pride marches in Muslim community areas, Muslim majority areas, to make a point, to say, haha, look, you're all homophobic. So there is that context, and actually we'd be able to have a much more frank discussion as Muslims about our problems, and there we have many problems, if we didn't always have this external threat, this shadow that we don't want to be feeding the bigots, we don't want to be giving them weapons to beat us with. Islamophobia is actually the #1 block to Muslim communities having these honest conversations. One thing I just got to say on the other question, I'll say this about the question about black Muslims. I mean, we're talking about black Muslims. Let's just be very clear. There are no black Muslims on this panel. That's a problem.
Hello. Wait, I mean, I'm black, so let's just. But this is the fact that you said there are no black Muslims here. Okay. This is the kind of erasure that happens because we have a certain assumption of what a black Muslim is.
And I say that as a British Muslim immigrant. I agree. My impressions and impressions of people watching at home. There may be people who wonder why are there not black Muslims who look like me? Why are there not more black Muslims on the panel? And that's my point. I think there is an issue. I was on a TV show in Britain once where there were 3 of us invited on the BBC. It's important because if we talk about the media, everything comes back to the media, I'm sorry to say, as a journalist. My industry is responsible for everything. Right? I was on a show in the BBC in England and there were 3 of us South Asian men from different South Asian countries, but who cares, as we say, South Asian men. And the presenter said, and there was no women, there were no black Muslims, there were no Arab Muslims, 3 South Asian men, and the presenter said, Mehdi, who speaks for Islam? Who speaks for Muslims? I said, apparently the BBC does, because you decided this panel. Muslims at home didn't decide this panel. And I think that's important to come back to the point about power, the point about how much decision making we make in these decisions. And I think, a lot of the things we do, we have these debates about all women panel, should you go on an all male panel? Just as a journalist, forget that. Similarly, we should have debates about race and gender and all sorts of other identity issues. And I agree with Amna, that's important to have, but we shouldn't forget the shadow that's cast upon us.
Yeah,
and I apologize profusely for my ignorance.
Yeah, I want to add to the point that was made by Zaheer as well as Mehdi, is that we have to realize that Islamophobia does not permit Muslims to be humanized. We have been cast as the boogeyman. And so for stories like the sister here that just shared, nobody wants to hear that, and nobody believes that even exists, because we're supposed to be this specific description of a person that is supposed to be feared, that is going to kill you, that it's going to do all these things to you. And so our stories, for us to be humanized, has not been given. One, based on the media. The media decides who to pick and choose. And I could tell you for sure that there is racism right there where we don't see African American voices. Why? Because they don't want Muslims to be seen as a part of the American fabric, as a part of the history of this country, which comes back to the African American Muslim experience.
Well, this branch of the media does believe that African American Muslims exist. As a matter of fact, we ventured to Harlem, to one of the most influential mosques in all of New York City that is actually a legacy of Malcolm X himself. So now I want to direct your attention to this video with Imam Talib.
The dominant emotion in the African American Muslim community is not fear, it's resistance. Because there's nothing that anyone can say to us that we have not, been there, done that.
You're living at a time of extremism, a time of revolution, a time when there's got to be a change. People in power have misused it, and now there has to be a change, and a better world has to be built.
Because I was raised in a spirit of resistance, and because this congregation was born out of a spirit of resistance, we have always reflected that in our worship, in the sermons that I give here. Because we are traumatized people, man. I know that. We're traumatized people with all kind of hurts and pains. We do face a kind of double whammy discrimination. That is our reality. We are black twice in America, as if being black once wasn't enough of a challenge. The forces who exploit fear and ignorance in America have always used those things as tools of division. So we must combat them by coming together, by combating division with unity, by combating hatred with love, by combating otherness with sameness.
God have mercy, they violated all of our rights.
We came to America in different ships, but now we're all in the same boat.
That was Imam Talib. We have a question here.
Yes, I'm a visitor to your city. I'm only here for a few days from New Zealand. And I just wanted to share to you my experience of traveling to America. I have got a British and New Zealand passport, but because of my Iranian parentage, I had to apply for visa. My visa waiver program was cancelled. And that obviously doesn't make Muslims like me, Iranians like me, feel welcome in New York. But I was in Museum of Modern Arts this morning, and I was really moved that next to a work of masters, the Museum of Modern Art has decided to display work by Iranian artists, just to make sure that people like me feel welcome in the city and to affirm the fact that New Yorkers welcome Muslims. So I just wanted to thank you, all of you, for that. It really just reduced me to tears. Also, this idea of mono-identity, I struggle with that. I'm often told that I'm not a real Muslim. And I just wanted to say that, yes, the media is responsible, and they do have a big share of responsibility for that. But I'm also disappointed with a lot of my Muslim friends and family members who shy away from associating themselves with their heritage and their Muslim religion because although they identify with it, they don't want to be defined by it. So I think it's very important that we try and encourage other Muslims to feel proud and step forward, because by stepping away, they're creating more room for people who are fundamentalists to occupy that space and create that kind of stereotypical vision of who a Muslim is.
Thank you. So that, Amna, I've been diving into your podcast recently, and you feature a lot of voices from all over the place in the Uncomfortable podcast, available on iTunes. But I wondered, when you are looking for those voices and you're centering those who are othered, what is your criteria? How do you bring people to the front that aren't atypical?
I think in a lot of ways, the podcast is sort of, it's like a manifestation of my own experience, right? I am not the idea that people have of what American Muslims look like. And when we split years growing up in Pakistan too, and over there, I didn't really fit in. Over here, I didn't really fit in. I think one of the things I'm hearing in these conversations and from everyone in the audience is that we all have to be better about recognizing that full spectrum of identity here. That's what I've been trying to bring forward on the podcast, in addition to talking to some white nationalists and white supremacists and other people, but that's a separate conversation for a separate town hall. But look, one of the recent voices that I featured was an imam who is out in California who is talking about raising up the next generation of American Muslims, about what it means to redefine, not that it needs a redefinition, but sort of like with every generation, communities change. What is the next generation of American Muslims going to look like? And there are things going on in different communities here that, statistically are interesting to me that affect how we practice Islam here. The fact that, only about half of American Muslims, people who self-identify as that, regularly attend a mosque. I don't think that's something most people know, and yet how many times do people go to a mosque or an imam and talk about, you speak for the community, you're the spokesperson for this entire place. race. And I think what the efforts being made by that Imam, the efforts being made by people, the hosts of the Good Muslim, Bad Muslim podcast, another couple of people we have coming up who are young Muslim Americans who are now running for office and would be making history if they do win in their races. Those are all just sort of signs of the times, of the way that the communities are changing, of the way our engagement is changing. And it's, you mentioned before the word dynamic. Like, I can't think of a better word to describe American Muslims right now. For all the Islamophobia, for all the fear, for all the suspicion, and let's be clear, it is a terrible time to be Muslim in America. There is so much change and dynamism within the communities too.
That religious figure you talked to from California, he spoke about reclaiming his name from J to Jihad and becoming the man that he is. And I'm looking at you, Moustafa, your book where you talk about young people who are coming of age or who have come of age post 9/11 and the struggles that they're dealing with. Where do you think they find their place in this American experiment with the push and pull of a culture and an outside world that's othering them at best and really pathologizing them at worst?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I've spent a lot of time talking to young American Muslims over the years, and including when I was writing my book. And what I've really found too is an embrace of their Muslimness. And a lot of that, I feel, comes out of a need to be able to define yourself in a culture that's trying to define you. So you see, actually, rather than the people running away from their Muslimness, there is some evidence of that. If you look at the polling data, they'll say maybe 15% or so. They actually have a way of polling that. But on the whole, it's actually, especially with young people, it is a sense of trying to embrace their identity, trying to understand their identity, and really trying to forge a future knowing that identity. One of the really interesting things I also found when I was writing my book was a constant invocation of this troubled American past that has this constant, repetitious sentiment of racism, whether all the different groups that Zaheer was laying out earlier. And in fact, a lot of young Muslims constantly point to that as well. And I actually found that very optimistic, because it really meant that young American Muslims were also historicizing rather than exceptionalizing their predicament. They really understand that they are at a kind of historical moment in this country, and they're moving forward, and they are, in a sense, on the vanguard of the country, pushing the country forward as well.
So you're an optimist?
My book came out almost 10 years ago, so maybe...
I could certainly say I'm an optimist, and I'll tell you why. On October 18th, and actually since the Muslim ban was announced back in January, leading the charge has been American Muslims. On a national level, on a local level, we've been out there organizing and mobilizing because we need to. And our role models and the people that we look up to are a part of the African American experience. Our Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, looking back at history and what those people did and what can we use from those lessons today. So for example, we are doing a national mobilization on October 18th, where cities from across the eastern region are going to mobilize to Washington, D.C. in front of the White House, protesting against the Muslim ban. And it's the first day of the Muslim ban to be instituted, but we're going to be out there with our allies to make sure that our voices are heard, that we refuse to accept this. And we will resist, until this ban is taken down.
But isn't the problem that the resistance is clear, and we saw in some of the videos earlier, clearly there's been massive activism in response to some of the stuff we've seen recently. We saw the airport protests were some of the most inspiring things I've seen. People around the world saw that, probably did more to counter anti-Americanism than anything in recent times. And we saw the Women's March. We've seen these great demonstrations that are coming together. And there is a silver lining, but I think, as Amna pointed out at the end of her last comment, we can't forget the cloud that goes with the silver lining. Yes, there's a silver lining, but the massive cloud is what depresses me. I mean, the challenge we face is so huge. It's not a modern phenomenon, I agree, but to have a president of the United States, to have a media that, for example, after the Muslim ban, I think 90 guests appeared on CNN in the 7 days after the Muslim ban, 9 of whom were Muslim, or 10 of whom were Muslim. Why would you have Muslims talk about Muslim ban? Madness. But it's such a big challenge that we face. As a parent of 2, my children are British and American. I've got 2 American Muslim daughters. I don't want to have conversations with them about Islamophobia. I don't want to have to tell my my daughter not to talk about religion or politics or Trump on the bus. I don't want to have to ask her, you know, what did your teacher say today about politics? Because 1 in 4 Muslim bullying cases involves the teacher. I don't want to have, you know, Muslim kids are not born with thicker skins than other kids. And I think we have to recognize we are in a unique moment, and I want to be an optimist, but I'm deeply depressed about that, you know, at least in the short term, I'm deeply depressed about what's happening and what Muslims in this room and beyond are going to have to go through and shouldn't have to go through. We've almost, even as Muslims, we've almost become normalized to this, the reality of Islam, talking about it for years and years, doing panels like this, and we shouldn't have to. Every time we discuss it, we should be equally outraged and equally unaccepting of this.
Yeah, but I think there is reason to be optimistic, and I'm gonna go even further. You know, Debbie said that this was being led by Muslim Americans. I'm gonna go a step further and say this is being led significantly by Muslim American women, and I think that is very significant. You look at the work that Debbie's doing, and you look at like Linda Sarsour and other, you know, the Muslim Arc, the Anti-Racism Collective, Marjorie Hill. I mean, I have been so encouraged. Yeah. Our panelists, I've been so encouraged by the seeing how significant Muslim women in general and younger people have been in leading this. And I like Moustafa's idea that they are historicizing. They're seeing themselves as part of a historical heritage, right? And part of that is understanding you might not win in your lifetime, right? But you advance the ball.
Of course.
And that, I think, is a very kind of real sense that I have sensed from talking to people who are organizing. And so I think that I'm
not questioning anything. I agree with every word you said. And I said the silver lining, I recognize. It's just the cloud. Let's be very clear. We haven't seen anything yet. If the guy in Las Vegas had been a Muslim, this would be a very different discussion right now. But you know, Nawaz very eloquently pointed out all of the measures that predate Trump. But those measures are going to look like, you know, candy floss compared to what this administration.
He wasn't Muslim, and I think.
But inevitably, at some stage, God forbid, there is going to be a terrorist attack on Trump's watch. And I think the community needs to be prepared for what's coming down the track.
Here's where we need to insert ourselves into the conversation and say this is not an issue. Excuse me, of Muslim terrorism. This is an issue. This is an issue of militarism. This is an issue of. This is an issue of toxic masculinity. This is an issue of the prevalence of guns. This is the issue of the resorting to violence to get your point across, whatever it is.
Agreed.
See, and that's where we have to kind of insert ourselves and shift that narrative. I mean, if you read the New York Times, to your point, you read the New York Times story of the shooter from Las Vegas. They went through all kinds of like, we have to find a reason to explain this. Like they couldn't, they didn't want to say what it was, right? And that it was whiteness, it was toxic masculinity. This man was like a slumlord. He like stood outside his building to shoot people during the LA uprising in '92, right? So, but they're like, oh, he was this, he was that, he was this, and see, this is where the role of the media really comes into play. And that's if all we do is say whew, because I did that too, whew. I was just like, thank God he's not black, thank God he's not Muslim. But we have to go beyond that and say what it is.
I agree.
Right?
Yeah, and I also want to point out to your point, Mehdi, about that we have to get prepared. Why do I have to get prepared? As a Muslim American, no, let me finish.
I'm saying that's the reality of the world we live in.
Why do I have to be prepared? I want my fellow Americans to see that I am just as a victim as anybody else. And that I want them, when people say, why aren't Muslims condemning this? Why don't we say that when there is white supremacists saying, why don't Christians condemn this?
Let's just
so
be
we
clear.
need to shift the narrative.
I agree with everything you're both saying. I've written this for 15 years. Right. I teach a course on terrorism, Islam, and the media. I agree with everything. All I'm saying is in the real world, we have to accept that things are not going to be easy in years coming forward. I want to be an optimist, but I just think sometimes we don't quite recognize the nature of the threat that faces us right now.
So one of the things that may be able to unite us.
No,
we're closing in on 4 minutes, and you guys are just waking up. Thank you. No, now we're actually 2 minutes away. But one of the things that can save us potentially is the squad, the coalition that we build, as is evidenced by the struggle for civil rights, for gay rights. So who's on the squad? What are the solutions that we can empower ourselves with when we walk out of this door 2 minutes from now? Nas, I heard.
Thanks, Myrna. Really, thank you. Sorry. I don't know. I'm sorry. I'm just still thinking about like optimism and what we were talking about earlier about like face-to-face contact. I just go back to the fact that my cousin, who was raised Christian in this country, voted for Trump. So I don't believe in that. I just don't believe that like human contact is going to be the salvation for us. But in terms of like going forward, I don't see any of this changing until we actually address and dismantle white supremacist toxic patriarchy in this country. Like, I don't see that Islamophobia is gonna magically disappear if we ignore anti-blackness, if we ignore white supremacy, if we ignore toxic patriarchy. Like, it's not gonna go away unless because those things exist in all, like Amna was saying, they exist in all communities. They're not specific to any one community. And so until those are dismantled, I don't see a future. Sorry.
We cannot end there.
Quick, say something positive, somebody.
I think there's a lot of reason to be pessimistic. I think recent years have really fed that idea, right? That there's not a lot of reason to have hope. For a lot of different reasons. But let's also remember that what American Muslims are going through right now is what a lot of other minority communities have been going through for generations. And the only way that any change has come about has been when individual people take it upon themselves to take whatever is within their power to act, whether you vote, whether you mobilize, whether you don't click on a story or click on a story. Like, there are so many ways in which individual Americans have grabbed that arc of American history and bent it. And that is the only way that things end up changing. And I want to thank you early for your shout out and whatever change you think I'm bringing about. I want to remind everyone, I'm a journalist, I'm not an activist. So I follow the discourse. Absolutely. And you know, I have the benefit of working with incredible colleagues who come to me and ask for input now. And being a voice in that community is what I think I'm contributing to the conversation. We all have our missions. We all have our ways of acting. We have to grab onto them and do it.
Well, speaking of voices in the community, I just wanted to acknowledge Imam Talib, who is here from Harlem. Thank you for being here, Imam. And now, I'm going to ask you to just give us something to go home with the last 5 seconds of the broadcast as we're wrapping up.
Oh, man. Yeah, I mean, I would say a couple of things, right?
One thing.
One thing. It'll be a couple of things. I don't think the challenge that people have with Muslims is rooted in something theological or legalistic, right? They can understand that Muslims have a God the way other religions have a God. There's a prophet, holidays, etc. The distinction that is there has to be understood is based on issues tied to race and class. And if we don't understand that, that's going to be part of the problem. The second thing that I would say...
That's going to be the final word because we're right up against our 9. Everyone in the room will get to hear it, but you should have been here at BRIC House. We appreciate you for watching. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. Right after this program, we encourage you to continue the conversation and check out everything we do online. Thank you again for being here. We appreciate it. Have a good evening.